All right. Well, thank you all for being here on a Saturday morning. I'm happy to start off the second day of the conference. For our first panel today, we have Christoph Neuberger and Shahin Vallée. And first off, is Christoph.
Hello, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm a scholar of media and communication studies and represent the Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin, a publicly funded institute. It's run by 5 universities and 2 research institutes, all from the region of Berlin and Brandenburg, and conduct interdisciplinary research on the digital society and have a focus on social sciences. I'm also a social scientist. I will present these 6 points today in 30 minutes. 30 minutes, okay. So, but before that, I want to say a few words about the things we discussed yesterday. We were talking about the technological weaknesses of Europe, especially of Germany. I'm not such a pessimist. We had a national election and our new government, and this government gives all these questions we discussed yesterday, all these weaknesses, a high priority. We'll give you just a few proofs for that. We have a newly created federal minister for state modernization and digitalization, who wants to establish a fast, digital, and capable Germany and a sovereign Europe to tackle bureaucracy. And now it's just 2 weeks ago that the government presented its high-tech agenda, aims to create a resilient, sovereign, and secure Germany through technology and research. They identified 6 key technologies which are developed in the next. Germany wants to become the leader in new technologies and especially increase its economic strength, cited now from the side agenda. Next Tuesday, when I hope to be back in Berlin, there will be a European Digital Sovereignty Summit hosted by the German and the French government, and speeches by Macron and Merzo. And you also, if you look now in the field of research, there was, for example, now the opening of an innovation park, AI in the city of Heilbronn, public-private partnership with the aim to become the most important European AI ecology. In yes, that is one project. Another project is the Hasso-Plattner Institute in Potsdam. Hasso-Plattner is one of the founders and owners of SAP, and he spends really a lot of money, and they want to recruit 80 professors for AI. And the one technical university in Munich, for example, around this university. So there are several examples to show that it's more in a positive mood for all these things. But today I'm not talking about technological and economic sovereignty, but about the democratic cultural sovereignty of Europe. I'm looking for institutional arrangements that can slow down or halt the erosion of liberal democracy and the rise of authoritarian forces. My topic is the creation of a European public sphere, which currently exists only in its infancy. It should be an expression of democratic and cultural autonomy, and at the same time safeguard it. A European public sphere is an old idea that has been discussed since at least the 1980s. It is seen as a necessary prerequisite for the full democratization of Europe. When I talk about Europe, I mean the European Union. The philosopher Jürgen Habermas, in particular repeatedly emphasized this point. Public opinion should be formed across borders, and that the citizens should be able to participate. However, empirical studies show that the European public sphere exists today primarily in the so-called vertical dimension. That means in the view toward Brussels, what happens in Brussels, what decisions are made there, and less in the horizontal dimension. That means the mutual exchange between the different national public spheres between the countries. And topics are rarely followed continuously. Instead, spotlight effects can often be observed when events are given short-term attention. For example, the European Parliament election, the Eurovision Song Contest, or this European Soccer Championship. What is missing is a common infrastructure in which a permanent European public sphere can be realized. And that is what I want to develop here to show how this can happen, how can it design such a common infrastructure. Now, digital transformation has fundamentally changed the conditions to the public for the public sphere. The dominance of platform and AI companies from the US and China has shifted the distribution of opinion power, also highlighted the vulnerability of national public spheres. Opinion formation can be easily manipulated from both outside and inside. Sovereignty lies with those who can protect the dissemination of public news and the public discourse. I will come back later to this point. So writing and talking about the multiple crises of the current time has become a genre in itself. Europe and Germany have lost touch and no longer have a voice in the world. The economy is weakening, the technological lead of the US and China is uncatchable, and our values are under threat. That was also what we heard sometimes yesterday. I will not join this chorus, but will instead discuss the conditions and possibilities of a specific project. I will examine the options for public service media. I've chosen Germany as a case study because they know best. So that was my first point. And now come to the second point, the meaning of values. This week, we witnessed an earthquake at the BBC. The resignation of the Director General and the head of news signals that media outlets that adhere to high standards must be consistent, and that violation of these standards will have consequences. These high standards mean that quality media outlets are highly vulnerable. This commitment to standards can be exploited for political interests. In Germany, for example, there are frequent public calls for more balance and diversity of opinion in programs. Such criticism often serves to expand the boundaries of what can be said publicly, broaden the corridor of opinion, and to give more radical positions access to the media. In Germany, we recently had the case of a young politically right-wing journalist, Julia Roos, who lost her job as a presenter of a political magazine program at Norddeutscher Rundfunk. That is one of these public service broadcasting stations that was criticized as a case of cancel culture. So what becomes apparent here is that different or maybe double standards are being applied. Public broadcasting has to perform better. It's more susceptible to criticism because it's legally bound to these standards. In the US, as you may know, the fairness doctrine was repealed by the FCC in 1987. That has contributed to the polarization of the public sphere. What is also visible here, the meaning of democratic values is not fixed, but rather a constant point of debate. This is not purely an academic debate, but also a political one. The meaning of value-related concept is often distorted so that they can be better instrumentalized for political purposes. For example, freedom has become one of these combat terms used to lament alleged restrictions on freedom, which are intended to broaden the scope of what can be said publicly. And this is the case, for example, when so-called speech bans, we had a big debate on this, are perceived simply because certain opinions are not left unchallenged. This instrumentalization of value-related concepts leads to a distortion of their meaning. This calls for a clarification of such concepts and a more precise research in political discourse. I see this as also as an important scientific task to contribute to sharpening the concepts in public discussions. That's what I want to do in the next points. Now, a normative view on the public sphere. There's a close connection between liberal democracy and the public sphere. The political public sphere is where democratic decisions on public affairs are to be prepared in processes of collective and individual opinion formation. What are the normative prerequisites for these democratic opinion formation processes? Democracy is also not a fixed concept, but is used in different ways and has changed historically. The core idea of democracy as the rule of the people centrally combines the two values of freedom and equality. Several theories of democracy added other related values. And in the special case of the public spheres, there are several proposals to systematize how normative theories of democracy can be applied to the public sphere and journalism. I will not discuss this in detail here because there are so many theories of democracy, liberals, participative, and so on. But these different theories agree that the media should first create a common public sphere and a common knowledge base. Both are necessary prerequisites for individual and collective opinion formation. A common public sphere needs mass audiences and a focus on similar relevant topics and valid and shared knowledge that requires news production based on journalistic standards, freedom of information, and equal access to knowledge. Beyond this, however, the theories make different demands regarding the process of opinion formation. Deliberative theory, for example, as known, I think, is Jürgen Habermas, who started to write the history of the public sphere, and then developed this idea of a deliberative public sphere. It demands a rational, respectful, and domination-free discourse in which the unconstrained persuasiveness of the better argument in the best case leads. In summary, and distinguish, and I hope I can show you 9 values I can derive from. So now, in summary, 9 values of the public sphere can be derived from the theories of democracy whose normative expectations partially overlap. These are these 9. I will go through this list in a moment. So because I use this list of values also to describe, and that is my fourth point, the crisis of the digital public sphere and liberal democracy. They can be used to systematically analyze the crisis of the digital public sphere. And behind every value is an own field of research. I'm not able to summarize now all these research. That is a synthesis of the main results. We had in the beginning high expectations for this digital public sphere. We expected a lot of freedom, free access to knowledge, to participate, everyone, and so on. But if we now have a realistic view on this, supported by empirical studies, then we revealed significant deficits for all values, knowledge quality, for example, disinformation, conspiracy theories. If you look at discourse quality, hate speech, and polarization, in the case of freedom, we have hardly strong control, especially in authoritarian regimes. We have even new forms of limiting freedom, like algorithmic selection. If we have the horizon of what we can see is limited because of this algorithmic selection, or chilling effect. So, in the case of equality, the digital divide, the unequal access and participation of different population groups, diversity, that was a big expectation that diversity is no longer a problematic point because everyone can publish everything he wants. But on the other hand, you can see in empirical studies and content analysis that it's only a small contribution to diversity of only media. That means the old mass media are still the agenda setters also in the digital public sphere. And there's another problem, this translation of the diversity of supply into a diversity of use. So we will use all these things which are out there. So, and then power symmetry, power is again concentrated on just a few platform and AI companies. Criticism and control, power and its abuse are largely invisible and hard to detect. Security, there's a long list of different security threats. And finally, the question of integration. Do we have an integrated public sphere? Empirical results are a bit contradictory if these numbers and filter bubbles really exist. So they say, no, not really. The real problem is the polarization. That means this tough conflicts between the contradictories. So that is in a short summary, the state of this digital public sphere. So my question is now, and at my point 5, how can liberal democratic values be better fulfilled in the digital public sphere? Better realization of these values cannot be achieved solely by regulating existing platforms and companies. That is what the trying to do with the Digital Services Act, for example, or with the AI Act. I think equally important is the creation of better platforms and AI models as value-based alternatives to commercial offerings that currently dominate the market. I want to show you that public service broadcasting provides a suitable framework for the development of such platforms and AI applications. Although PBS is controversial and slow to embrace digital transformation, it is a well-established and proven system, not in all countries, but in several countries. Its mission refers precisely to these mentioned democratic values. It plays a major role in only a few countries, as I already mentioned. But it's often depends on the normative expectation placed on media system. There's a typology of different media systems from Daniel Helen, Paolo Mancini. They say liberal media systems, such as in the US, emphasize free speech and the role of journalism as watchdog and producer, objective reporting. That means that media markets are minimally regulated, following the optimistic vision of a self-regulating marketplace of ideas. In contrast, democratic corporatist media systems in North and Central Europe are characterized by a stronger orientation towards the variety of democratic values seen as common good. State interventions aimed at enabling the media to fulfill their function for democracy. So I have chosen Germany as an example. Today, PSP in Germany continues to be of great importance. Critics often claim publicly that journalism and public broadcasting in particular is experiencing a crisis of trust. However, there's no empirical evidence to support this. On the contrary, journalism enjoyed the highest level of trust. The journalism of public service media enjoyed the highest level of trust among the media. It's still the top most trusted medium in Germany. It's 61% to say they give it's very or somewhat trustworthy, the public service program. Trust has declined only slightly in the recent year. Around 20% of the population distrusts. This rejection is closely linked to political attitudes, especially the supporters of the far-right-wing AfD Alternative for Germany. The party, at the moment, the only important far-right-wing party in Germany. And their supporters reject the public service broadcasting. The share of total media usage is high. The combined market share of ARD and ZDF, that are the two big public service television companies, slightly more than half of the total television market. So they have a dominant position. There are also successes in the digital public sphere with its app and social media accounts. The newscast Tagesschau is the most successful news offering in Germany. The content network Funk, for younger users, we did several research projects together with this content network. Funk operates a variety of successful formats on digital platforms such as Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And that is really an interesting experiment because they tried to translate this public service mission to this platform. So how to make, for example, political formats fit to fulfill this mission on the one hand, on the other hand, to be attractive for the young audience. So how can this continuing high level of acceptance be explained? My thesis is that the federal system of Germany helps to keep tensions low and avoid escalation that could lead to the end of public broadcasting, for example, through the abolition of the broadcasting license fee, through a constant process of negotiation between the 16 federal states. Germany has 16 federal states, and they always have to make a new treaty, the media treaty, if they want to change anything. So Since 1987, the treaty concluded between these states has been revised 28 times. Two further revisions are currently underway. By the time a new state treaty comes into force, the next treaty is often already negotiated. That means we have a multi-step coordination process. The Broadcasting Commission of the German states drafts a contract and consults with stakeholders and citizens. The draft is approved by the state president, and all 16 state parliaments must give their approval. This requires consensus among all federal states, which are also governed by different parties. That means to date, consensus could be achieved in all cases. So it is a successful way to negotiate the next step in broadcast politics. The discussions can be very tough. So-called reform treaty is currently being decided in the parliaments, implements proposals made by the future council, a commission of experts that has drawn up far-reaching recommendations. The tendency to block the treaty is particularly strong in the so-called new federal state, and the territory of the former GDR. Saxony has already given its approval in Brandenburg. The government is threatening to collapse because the parties cannot find consent. So when a federal state tries to block a decision, then the Federal Constitutional Court, the Bundesverfassungsgericht, also plays a role. We had the case in 2021 when Saxony-Anhalt, one of these states, did not want to approve an increase of the license fee. The Federal Constitutional Court prevented the blockade with the argument that the fee increase could not be rejected for political motives. So this constant involvement with PSP gives the impression that something always needs to be repaired or improved. However, the need for consensus helps to ensure agreement on the next small step for reform. Also, there is a lot of public criticism of individual programs, persons, or even the system itself. Only the far-right AfD party questions PSP in principle. PSP is under close public scrutiny. There are two mains of contention, but before I want to show you this, when I was surfing this morning, several German news outlets, so I found this. That is the cover story of the Spiegel of this week. So Spiegel is the most influential German news magazine. And Sind die noch zu retten? It translates, can they still be saved? And it's about public service broadcasting. First program, ARD and ZDF. So that is not so seldom that magazines like the Spiegel have these questions on their cover. So and that also shows that this constant debate about these questions. And one main point of contention are the license fee. It's at the moment 80 euro, 36 cents per month. And it's unlikely that it will be increased in the next future because that means also that broadcasting companies will therefore have to make extreme cutbacks. They will receive at the moment about 8.7 billion euro per year. It means that we have still the most expensive public broadcasting system in the world. The other point of debate is the performance. It also means that this growing pressure on PSP to provide evidence of their performance legitimize itself changed a lot in the last year. So there's now a lot of passion and also duty for the broadcasting stations to find their quality standards, show evidence that they really fulfill them. That was the situation in Germany. I don't have the time to look now to different other countries in Europe, like France, Italy, Austria, and Switzerland. Maybe we will do that in the discussion. I will come now to my final point, projects for European media platform. Come back what I discussed at the beginning of my presentation. Now the question is, how can Germany's experiences help in the development of a European public sphere? The idea of a European digital media platform, permanent infrastructure, has been under discussion since 2017, has its origins in public service broadcasting. its implementation, it's still an important point. For example, mentioned as a goal, even the coalition agreement of the current federal government in Germany. So at the moment, there are several projects and plans in Europe aimed at creating such a platform. For example, of the Council for European Public Space, which developed a concept of a decentralized platform for trustworthy news. It's funded by the EU. Then there's a public spaces incubator that is a network of several public service media working together to develop platforms for better public dialogue. And the second German television, ZDF, presented in 2025 its plan for public interest-oriented digital public open space. And there would be the possibility for other content providers, if they agree with standards, also to offer their content on this platform. And then there was also then there's also a joint cultural television channel, Arte, and it's a collaboration between France and Germany. And there's was an agreement also this year between the government to develop this channel, this Arte, to an European media platform. It's already provided in 6 European languages, this cultural television channel, which also has a huge website. So these projects are still in their infancy. They are mostly still plans. You can see a lot of results. So it remains to be seen whether these plans can be successfully put into practice. I see 2 main challenges. The first challenge is to reach political agreement between the participating European countries on the creation and design of such a platform. The German federal system could serve as a model for the institutional arrangement. Here, 2 minor adjustments are likely to be necessary on an ongoing basis, which will have to be renegotiated time and again. These negotiations should take place within a framework of values that describes the platform's mission. So the second challenge, specific applications created by editorial teams. Digital transformation is a continuous process of change, which means that conditions for the realization of democratic values are also perpetually changing. We see that, for example, now a lot of students are now experiments with AI. This requires ongoing learning and the weighing up of new, initially unknown chances and risks. This is implemented, for example, in innovation labs or in pioneer communities. For example, in the German AI for Media network, where new AI applications for better information, discussion, journalism are developed and tested. And for a European public sphere, we now have the advantage that AI is able to translate. We have this language barrier in Europe, so it's much easier now to overcome this language barriers. Now I come to the end. To conclude, what is needed is an experimental approach to exploiting the opportunities and limits of digital technologies for democracy, following John Dewey and this concept of experimental democracy, or Karl Raimund Popper and his piecemeal technology. Both authors recommended small reversible steps to test new paths in democracy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We now have Shahin Vallée presenting. I don't know if you're going to switch.
Okay, that's okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. It was great to hear you. I feel very intimidating sitting on this panel because I'm neither a scholar nor a specialist of the media. So I'm going to be improvising a lot. So if you have any complaints, you can address them to Stefanos for this odd choice of panel. But addressing this crisis of legitimacy, I'm wearing a tie on a Saturday, and I hope that will be my lifeline to some sense. I want to talk about Europe too, but as you have spoken a lot about Germany, I will end my talks talking a lot about France. And I think there's a lot of overlap between what you said and what I meant to say. We've spoken a lot over the last day about sovereignty and democracy, and we tend to define democracy as rule of law and free and fair elections, and we often forget that there's no such thing as democracy without also free and fair media. And I think we are in Europe, I think in the world, but I think in Europe in particular, experiencing a very special crisis of the media, which is kind of stuck between, I think, three important forces. One is technology revolution, and we've discussed that quite a bit yesterday, and I'll speak a bit more about that today and its interaction with media in particular. The second is sort of a crisis of representation or trust in the elite, which I think is affecting the media in particular. And the third, which I'll spend some time on, which I don't think we should underestimate, and which I was surprised you actually did not mention, is foreign interference. And I think foreign interference is something profound. And I think we're entering potentially a new world in terms of foreign interference, and I'll get to that. We've been used to think about foreign interference as something coming from the East, and it might not be coming from the East anymore. And so for technology, I think there is a very troubling dynamic between the expansion of technology, and in particular of social media, and traditional, and a very odd dynamic at play, potentially also intensifying with AI, whereby traditional media are somewhat feeding the beast that is coming after them. And this is something that we see quite visibly today with AI, but which has been ongoing for a long time. There was actually an important legal battle between Google and the European media. At the time, in the early 2010s, a lot of the European media were complaining essentially that Google was sucking up content from traditional media providers, not remunerating media providers, and basically entirely hijacking them. There were very intense negotiations between Google and European governments that led to some ad hoc solutions, in particular in France, but then at the European level, the creation of a media innovation fund that was funded by Google, and which was really designed to avoid legislation that would actually force Google to remunerate media content providers fairly. And this has actually held back European solutions for a long time. So French agreed in 2013 to a 60 million euro media innovation fund funded by Google, which they thought was an incredible amount of money to basically help traditional media transform and being more technology savvy. So that helped fund a number of transition of traditional media to an online presence. That was really a drop in the ocean. So that was a 3-year fund of 60 million euros, which of course evaporated very quickly. Then there was an equivalent at the European level, and that delayed something that came almost 10 years later with the copyright law, which then forced Google and others to basically remunerate media for clicks. But we wasted essentially more than 10 years. And during that time, we allowed technology company, starting with Google, but basically start to eat into European media landscape. I think that fight for survival of the traditional media versus technology companies has intensified also with, I think, the erosion of trust and confidence in the media, which is such that today you have a majority of Europeans with quite a large dispersion between countries, a majority of Europeans who say openly that they've lost trust in traditional media and who consume media predominantly. That depends a lot from country. So in France, we're at quite low levels. 25% of French people trust traditional media. 69% of Finns trust traditional media. So you have quite wide dispersion, but basically on average, we're about 50% of the population in Europe that doesn't trust traditional. I think that provides for a pretty apt terrain for manipulation of content and for manipulation of opinion. So we've had these discussions in the past about certain elections, the extent to which content manipulation in Brexit played a role. I think we had very clear cases in Europe in elections in Romania recently, in Serbia a bit before, where political actors that were entirely unknown to traditional media but had an incredible TikTok or Facebook following ended up emerging as very strong candidates, and with a very active push of these candidates through social platform. That leads me to this point I want to make about foreign interference. I think it's been clear and established that we've had a number of foreign interference in particular in Eastern Europe. I think we've had them also in Western Europe, and to some extent we have either decided to look the other way. I'm thinking in particular of the 2017 election in France, where there were actually quite a number of pretty intense hacking operations on the Macron campaign. I remember it, even though most people don't remember it, because it happens that actually a trove of emails was made public as a result of these hacking, including email exchanges I had with him and with his team. So I've experienced that firsthand. And that has only intensified since 2017. My biggest worry now, and I'm going to turn a bit more to France and to the upcoming French elections, is that I think we have now a perfect storm on the horizon for these sorts of foreign interference. We have in France a candidate or a set of candidates on the far right that are liable to be heavily supported by these sorts of foreign interference, coming from Russia principally, not only. And I think we have, and that's maybe for the first time, a profound change in the US vis-a-vis these interference. And I can't help but think about two very singular events in the last year that to me signal that pivot. One is a speech that J.D. Vance gave at the Munich Security Conference February, basically just before the German election, where he refused actually to meet the chancellor and essentially used that platform to campaign for the AfD pretty vocally, and to basically question Europe's choices around democracy, immigration, and so on and so forth. So you had basically in the person of the US vice president, a very clear attack on what would be considered traditional European values. I think this was a very violent shock to Germans, or at least to the Germans and yet, after a few emotional speeches by Friedrich Merz, it seems that this fear has sort of vanished or disappeared. There was another troubling event during that same campaign, which was the very active campaigning Musk for the AfD, including taking part in the AfD's largest campaign event and speaking remotely and encouraging them very strongly. Not clear exactly how involved in European politics Musk will want to be in the future, given that he's less involved in the US apparently. But what's pretty clear is that X, or his social media endeavor, will be a very important vehicle and continues to be very important. So I think for the first time, and I think the French elections will be the first time that this is tested, because to some extent the German elections arrived too soon to the US election to be really a testing ground. We will have in France the conjunction of, in my view, very intense media, social media, potentially hacking interference by Russia, as well as potentially very active use of sort of algorithmic social media by US technology companies to drive the campaign. And I think that's a pretty unique set of circumstances that I'm not sure Europe in general and France in particular is prepared to deal with. And I view that as a pretty concerning moment, and potentially as a turning point that I don't think we have fully assessed. I'm in particular troubled by the extent to which the US administration, encouraged by big technology firms, is going after the few and slim rail guards that Europe has against this, in particular, the moderation of content that was forced by European co-legislators on companies, the Digital Market Act and the Digital, so the DMA and DSA that are kind of both, establishing a bit the guardrails around what could happen. The last thing we have against this, given the weakness of our antibodies, would be our traditional media. And this is where I want to turn to the specific dynamic that I think has affected the French media, is essentially, to call it bluntly, a complete takeover of French media. And here I rely a lot on the works of others, and in particular on Julia Cagé, who has done a lot of work on this in France. We've had essentially since the early 2000s, but really intensifying over the last 5 to 10 years, a complete takeover of the entire media landscape, whether it is radio, TV, or newspaper, whether they be national or regional, by French billionaires. And I think in some parts of French sort of, technocratic structures, this is viewed maybe as something that is better than the alternative, which would be a takeover by foreign media companies. But I think this is potentially a poison in that I think it intensifies also the distrust in traditional media. And so we have here this weird solution where I think it's been established. Some political leaders were very happy to see these billionaires or some of these billionaires take over media because they were thinking that it would at least stabilize the capital structure, that would at least allow to keep employment relatively stable in some of these media organizations, which otherwise would all have gone bankrupt. Because it's true, and maybe I'll get to that, very few of these billionaires are acquiring these media for economic returns. They're doing it either for symbolic returns, the equivalent of a trophy wife, or because of influence. And it's a weird combination of the two. In some cases, there's little involvement of the billionaire and his companies in the editorial line of the media. And so you could argue that this is kind of the trophy wife line. In others, there's a clear and direct involvement, and that's been the case of a few very important people. This is an unreadable picture, but that's deliberate. I'll try to make it a bit more readable by explaining a few things happening. So essentially now the media landscape in France is almost entirely controlled by these 9 families or 9 billionaires, some of them coming into the picture very recently. So Dassault has been, an owner of Le Figaro for a very long time. Bouygues has been an owner of TF1, the first private TV channel for a very long time, since the early 90s. So these are kind of the old family and the old businesses. What is newer is a few things. So the expansion of Bolloré as a media owner, which really also accelerated after the failure of even National, in which basically Bolloré took over. Bolloré also took advantage of the generational change at Lagardère, where basically the son kind of destroyed the family business and basically ended up being forced to sell a large part of his media assets to Vincent Bolloré. And Bolloré, I think, has become maybe the most visible image of the billionaire who does, so he's not the trophy wife type, he does get involved very directly in editorial choices, hiring and firing journalists, changing shows that were historically very successful. And he's basically said that he had a clear right-wing agenda. if not a far right wing. Patrick Drahi is more the trophy wife type. He's invested heavily in French media, in particular Libération, and is now slowly disengaging. And as he disengages, Rodolphe Saadé, who's a new kid on the block, the CEO of CMA-CGM. So CMA-CGM is this one of the largest shipping company, which was, and this is the irony of business, which was in 2019 almost bankrupt, was actually saved by a credit line by the BPI, like Banque Publique d'Investissement. So it was a struggling shipping company, which had a complete reversal of fortune, as many did during COVID, and basically, was actually the most profitable company in France and in France's history during that period, and accumulated as a result of that tremendous fortune, which helped him to take over some of Patrick Drahi's media assets and to become a leading figure in media today. You see through these also political lines emerging. And so when the underlying current is basically that Rodolphe Saadé and Xavier Niel. So Xavier Niel was an early investor in Le Monde, and through a succession of transactions became the only or the largest investor in Le Monde. He was first brought into Le Monde as kind of a backdoor financier for a big transaction that at the time involved Pierre Berger, and eventually became, through a number of tactics that I can describe if you're interested, the largest owner of. He basically is close to Macron as well as Rodolphe Saadé, and I think the two of them embody the sort of centrist, less involved for the time being in the editorial line. But what's interesting, and I'll stop with the inside baseball, is that Rodolphe Saadé hired as the head of his media group a former Vincent Bolloré executive. So there's a question here as to, is he hiring because of how they have been involved in editorial management, or is he hiring because he wants to hedge and have an opening to maybe something that will be closer to the right or to the far right? So there's a big question mark. And last, I'll finish with him. Bernard Arnault has been invested in media for a long time as well, in Les Echos in particular, which is, I would say, the French equivalent of the Wall Street Journal, so kind of the financial paper. And I think here there is a question mark as to where does Bernard Arnault sit politically. And I think for the longest time, he was viewed as a bit like Niel and Saadé, as sort of sitting in the center. And I think there are now growing question marks around that. Could he actually move over time to become an ally of Bolloré, or an ally of somebody that is not here, Pierre-Edouard Stérin, who is kind of not a billionaire, but somebody who has been very invested, but on the very far right spectrum, and who has actually announced very clearly a plan to build a media presence on the far right. And so I think the big fear when you have an ecosystem like that is that you could have very quickly a reconfiguration of alliances amongst France's great capital in favor of media actions that would be aligned with some of the foreign interference I have mentioned. And I think that's my answer to can the traditional media can protect us from these foreign interference? The answer is it depends how they are owned and how they are managed. And I think the example we have in France is somewhat concerning and could flip very quickly. There is an acute perception of that in France too, and I think that's also intensifying the distrust in French media. So that sounds pretty dark. And so I want to conclude by two words of hope. The first is that there has been at least two, and I'll focus on these two, quite successful media experiments during that period. And I'm not going to go into it, maybe I should, into smaller online media like Brut and others that actually have been very successful in addressing young population because they produce content that is basically horizontal videos designed for phones and for streaming. So there are a few success cases, but there are two, I think, more meaningful success cases. One is Mediapart. So founded by Edouard Plenel in 2008, Edouard Plenel and a few others in 2008, which has insisted very early on in taking no advertising money, which no newspaper in France does, and to be fully transparent about the shareholding and essentially being owned in the beginning by a few investors, but essentially now almost entirely by the rédaction. So it was founded with a 3 million euro capital. And now, a bit more than 15 years later, it has 230,000 paid subscribers, makes about 25 million euros in revenues and nets 3 million euros in profit, which by the standards of media company is an astounding success. It's an astounding financial success. And it's also, everybody has its political views on that, but I think it's been also a pretty successful media in the sense that it has also it really built its credibility on reporting and on particular on reporting around financial corruption. And it has, I think, proven its effectiveness with at least two major cases, interestingly, against the left wing and against a right wing politician. The first one is Pierre Cahuzac, who was a minister for budget, who Mediapart revealed had a Swiss bank account where he was basically avoiding. He was doing tax evasion, which he denied publicly in front of Parliament. And Mediapart proved that lying, and he had to step down and eventually charged, sentenced. The other, which you may have seen more recently, is the more impressive case against Sarkozy. Basically, Mediapart uncovered a thread of evidence that eventually led to Sarkozy being charged for corruption. Not sentenced for corruption in the end, being sentenced in French for association de malfaiteurs, so basically collusion to organize a crime, but without the court being able to prove that there was a crime actually undertaken. But that led to his incarceration, which is history. So if we go by these standards, Mediapart has been an astounding. The other success I want to talk about, and that might sound a bit self-serving because I've been quite involved with it, is Le Grand Continent, which essentially, and I think it's an interesting illustration of a very different model. It essentially started as a student project by people from the École Normale Supérieure at Ulm, and who essentially wanted to talk about exactly what you discussed, which is the absence of a European public sphere, the need to basically create a European journal to talk about the world, but in a European way. And so their idea was to kind of build the European version of foreign affairs. So they started from scratch, really bootstrapping the workaholic capacities that you can find at the École Normale, incredible volunteering of people who were prepared to work tirelessly and translate text endlessly. And they've built over now almost 10 years, one of the most successful French media, also self-sustaining through subscription and through, so they don't have any advertising, but they do a bit of private events that give them some revenue. So for instance, actually going to New York for that early December, they're hosting a summit in the Italian Alps that is kind of sponsored by a bunch of European corporates, and that helps them finance a bit the operation of this. And one thing that they have done, which I was not necessarily in agreement with when they made that choice, is to choose to publish as little as possible in English. Basically, their line is the European language is the language of translation. So what we need to do is address people in their language. And if we are writing in English, we're basically going to be, sitting or talking to people who read the FT. No disrespect, Jonathan, or foreign affairs, and that's we want to talk to a broader audience. And I thought that this was not necessarily the best choice, but they really went on with this and fairly successfully. I think what's been missing to their effort is a more deliberate effort to do things in German and in Germany. So they had at some point a Polish edition, a Spanish edition, an Italian edition, but they've done very little in German. And I think that's missing. But one thing that they have done at their own cost and at quite a high cost is to conduct pan-European polls, which we lack tremendously, and which I think are an integral part of forging a European public opinion and of making European policymakers and politicians aware that there is such a thing as a European public opinion, even if there may not be a very well-formed public sphere. And for instance, they conducted a pan-European poll after April and the Liberation Day. And it found, and I think they did that like late May or early June, and they found that there was an overwhelming desire in Europe for a very strong response against the US. And a very high degree of frustration about the incapacity of European leaders and national leaders, for that matter, to basically oppose the US more vigorously. I was not surprised by that, given the French context and dormant French anti-Americanism that exists. But I was a lot more surprised to see that feeling shared across Europe. Not exactly of course, with some dispersion, but even in Germany, there was a very strong desire for a strong response, which you would not expect hearing German politicians talk about it. So I want to end with this maybe, that I'm quite worried that the 2027 election in France will be a critical moment for testing our democracies, because it will be a critical moment for testing our media infrastructure. And by that, I mean our ability to respond to social media interference, but also the solidity of media ownership in France and its consequence on the media, sort of the editorial line, with, I think, given what I've described here, shifts that could be pretty massive just from one or two people changing their opinion about this section. And I'm thinking of, Bernard Arnault, for instance, as potentially a very important swing element here. The fact that, if Bernard Arnault swing, I think it's more than, the economic might of LVMH, it's basically potentially shifting the entire balance of the media landscape. And I think I'll end here.
Great, thank you. We now have about 45 minutes up to that for discussion. And when you have questions, you could just introduce yourself. Rob, and tell you.
So probably because I think one of the most striking cases of election interference of recent times is happened in Argentina, which is not particularly mediated through the media. It's kind of economic rather than media, in a sense. But the US Treasury kind of essentially gave an ultimatum to the Argentine public: you've got to vote a certain way, otherwise you're not getting this support for your economy. At the same time, other countries in Latin America, the confrontations with Colombia, for example, media level, oligarchic structures where quite often owners of media will, the long-term tendency with Latin America, there's often a part of the ruling class in any given country which is quite sort of aligned to US interests against national interests. Starting to see that in some of these contexts, damning Petro as much as Trump, for example. Imagine the combination of those two phenomena being something quite destructive on national levels. I mean, it's easy to see in Latin American context. Harder to imagine it in that configuration quite in Europe, but when you have precedent like that on a global level, that seems to be something that one should be worried about.
I think there are a lot of examples also in Europe. France, think about Italy and the Berlusconi family. So started in the 1980s, so he not only have a dominance in the private media sphere, but also when he became president, it was also very influential in the rise. So public service media. So there are a lot of examples, I think, of the past. So the question is, we have really efficient laws to do anything against it. So, and it's not only a question of economic concentration, but also about who has opinion power. So we divide this in German law between law, question of how big is part share of the whole market, someone, but also the question about opinion power. It's much harder to measure this opinion power. So German politicians struggled now for about 20 years to revise this law. So it's still limited to national television market. So it's not revised for the digital world. So I wrote 2 reports for this commission, so to explain how to measure opinion power. And we really had a turning point. You mentioned it. In the past, we always thought that platforms owners only want to make money. So but really turned now, what happened now with Elon Musk buying Twitter and then named it X, so that he uses this as a political megaphone. So, and not only in his own country, but especially in Europe. I mentioned the cases in Germany. Also, you could also have this talk with Alice Weidel, the chair of the AfD, right-wing party. So, but the question is still, we are doing empirical research also about the effects of media, if you are able to measure these effects. So, and maybe it's more important that the traditional media report about these cases, give them much more reach and make it really a topic than just to be quiet and say, okay, he can do whatever he wants on X. So maybe that is more influential than the case itself. So it's really hard to find evidence for these effects, also starting with the Cambridge Analytica case. So I don't know a study who really gives evidence that this changed the result of the election then. So maybe it's, let's say, a side effect of other media who give them much more reach than they would have.
So I would only add, and I wanted to mention this in introduction, that there is also, for reasons that we can discuss that I think are fascinating, a very deliberate focus on the part of this new cahoot of sort of US government official and technology titans, a real desire to destroy Europe or to fight against a certain idea of Europe. And so, to some extent, Argentina is important because it's viewed as an ideological ally. But I think the battle for Europe is a lot more important to them than Argentina or Colombia. And so I think the means they will deploy in that battle are liable to be essentially greater than the $20 billion swap line from US Treasury. I think, this is for them ideologically, and I think this is why I think the speech of J.D. Vance at Munich was so important. I think for them, ideologically, it's a much bigger battle, one that deserves a lot. And what I find really scary, and maybe to me that was the most scary moment of this whole first year of office, is to see this dinner of him with all the big tech giants around the White House for dinner, where basically they all kissed the ring and somewhat promised to whatever it takes. That to me is a combination of that plus whatever we had before with Russian interference makes for a big factor. Because to some extent, in the places you've mentioned, Russia and the US are on opposite end, or Russia and China are on opposite end of the battle. And so maybe that creates a bit of setting dynamic. In Europe, I think they're not. They're on the same side of the battle.
US and China, or the US and
US and Russia.
Russia.
I'm thinking about the French case. Basically, you will have the same sort of support for Le Pen, Bardella by Russia and by the US, which I don't think will be the case in Argentina or in Colombia.
Elvira, you're going to take that.
Yes, this is not exactly my main expertise area on social media and communication, but I have just questions for both of you. For Christoph, you mentioned a lot the need to have an European media platform, and also I agree with that, because especially, for example, inside the European Commission, as you know, the European Commission is quite complex, and part of the majority of the decisions that are taken there, we at the society, we are not aware, and they doesn't go to the persons. But for example, we have Euronews, and in your view, we should reinforce already Euronews or to establish new media platforms. Also, as you know, we are now discussing the next framework program, FP10, maybe added inside the next program. But also, I'd like to have your idea concerning Euronews, already a media platform from Europe, what you have mentioned in your speech. For Shahin, we are facing a very problematic situation, especially for concerning these fake news, biased news. I would like to ask you, what should we do to regain confidence, especially on the conventional media? Because in my opinion, for example, I don't use social networks. I just use LinkedIn, but the new generations are not using, they are using all the others. And in my opinion, we have two main problems: the media itself that are producing this type of news, and also the community that they are clients, because they cannot survive without clients. What is? And thank you very much for your consideration.
Okay. You mentioned Euronews. I'm not sure who is the owner at the moment. There were so many changes in the ownership of Euronews.
Yes, also I'm not inside, but Euronews is, I guess, belongs.
Yes. But I think the market share is so small, and it was tried to build this European public sphere. You remember the European from Maxwell, the British publisher. He's in the late 1980s, so success. So I think the problem is that the big audience is hard to get with these media. So Financial Times, the most important European medium, but clear, very special group. So, and the question is how to get the masses on such a platform. So, there's also the questions for all these projects I mentioned. So, and it's easy to make such a vision so that everyone comes then to this platform. So, we have the competition with this dominant platform. How can you make such a platform attractive that the young people come from TikTok or Instagram then to this new platform? So maybe it's better what Funk does in Germany to go on these platforms and to try to make their better offers, which you they are so to counterwind the not so interesting or not so good things, hate speech and one. So that may be even the better way. So, and as I said, the most important point is how to make it also not the technological infrastructure. So
I would say two things. So first, I think we need to have a much more pointed and aggressive attitude towards social media content and the moderation of content. So I think we were slowly going there in Europe, and we're, I think, very fast backtracking given the both big tech and US government pressure that we're experiencing. So I think we should not backtrack on that at all. And we should make sure that basically hold we hold these companies to account on content moderation. But maybe Asma can speak about that because she knows that a lot better than I do. And I think the other point for media, so I don't know, so where I have a slight discomfort is I think the danger of public funding of media, which I think is part of the solution, is also to entrench incumbents and to prevent the entry of new entrants in the media. And I think we should also encourage new entrants. So the French funding today of media is extremely favorable to incumbents and basically does not help new media. I think we have to find a model that's different. We have to find a model that will actually help the media like Mediapart or, for instance, like I mentioned, Le Grand Continent. Le Grand Continent has been in existence for almost 10 years, never received €1 of public funding. That's not normal. I think so. I think the same way, in my view, it's healthier to have largely public funding of electoral campaigns. I think it will be healthy to have public funding of media. And I think the best way to give a bit of, what can I say, a bit of checks and balances and to reduce also the potential footprint of the public sector and of the state is basically to have a matching model whereby you say, for every euro of subscriber that you get or every euro of advertising that you get, the state will match, for instance. I'm making things up, but that's essentially some of the ideas that Julia Cagé has proposed to basically range a set of public funding for the media that is not so skewed to the incumbents, that allows new entrants, and that basically kills the power of private capital in the editorial market.
Jonathan Derbyshire from the Financial Times. So I guess I'm here as a representative of the legacy media, so-called. One of the striking things that emerged from both presentations was dramatically different levels of public trust in France, Germany, in traditional media and in public interest. Broadcasting. So, Christoph, I think you said that the levels of trust in Germany are relatively high. How do you both account for that dramatic difference? What is it about those two policies that there's widely different levels?
The public trust the figure was
For media, for traditional media,
for the public traditional media, and also people really differ between different media. So we have an annual survey in Germany about media trust. University of Mainz, and they really very elaborated way. So we can see differences between the media. The top is public service broadcasting, and at the end are social media platforms. So if you ask general about trust in media, then it's the meaning of all these different kinds of media. And there are also a lot of differences between topics. That is also topics, war in Ukraine. So it's much lower, the trust. So there are other topics. And so that means you have to be very cautious if you compare that such results. I think the best source is the Digital News Report. That is University of Oxford, also an annual survey in about 50 countries. So same questionnaire with same questions. So and if you compare then, so the countries from all over the world, which differences between all these countries. But also you can see also there that Germany is one of these countries where media trust is higher than in many other countries. My explanation, just to mention, is that we have still this very strong public service media, and we also don't have this problem in the private media, in the quality press. Think about Der Spiegel or FAZ Süddeutsche Zeitung. They're really the quality press, which are not owned by billionaires. So there's still not much influence from economy or politics.
What about Bild?
Well, that is, yes, that is an exception. That is a so-called Springer Presse from Axel Springer, a traditional conservative media house, and Matthias Döpfner. He also bought here in the US Politico, for example. So, and he is very close friend from Peter Thiel. So, and so that is the exception. But the Springer Press is no longer as influential than the earlier days. The Bild, that is the most tabloid, once had a circulation of 5 million copies, so it's about 1 million copies. So sold all other newspapers. One exception, Die Welt, the world, as a national paper, but they've sold other regional and local papers, so they don't have the dominance like in the late 60s. Protests against the Springer Press.
Springer tried to buy the FT 10 years ago. Low shave. Springer tried to buy the FT.
Yes, definitely.
And you're, sorry, I'm jumping on your, I'll answer your question, but, and are you worried that Bild, and given its ties to the US, could be a point of weakness in the media landscape in Germany? It could eventually end up being a lot more in support of the AfD than it has been so far?
So, how to say, of the Bild changed several times. The Bild died in 1986. It was a clear conservative program. So, and it changed because they wanted to earn money with the paper, so that was more important for many years. So, at the moment, there was, for example, Kai Diekmann and several others, with also a conservative program, but they now had to leave the Bild side. Not so clear the position. I don't know current content analysis who checks the position of the Bild side in comparison.
And briefly, my explanation for why the trust in France is weaker than other places in Europe, I think we have a more profound crisis of democracy and crisis of trust in the elites in France than in others. In part because I think of consequences on trust and confidence of our institutional makeup, and in particular the Republic. I think Germany, being a federal state and also being it has its dysfunctions, but I think a fairly healthy and functioning parliamentary democracy, I think, creates a lot less resentment against being and a lot less distance than we observe in France. And so to me, I view this trust in media as another expression of the Gilets jaunes crisis. Basically, the Gilets jaunes crisis was revealing something quite profound about the organization, the democratic organization of the country, as well as this kind of the spatial organization of the country. So a crisis of periphery versus center, of provinces versus the capital, of the poor versus the capitalists. So I think France is kind of interspersed with many of these crises that contribute in elites broadly, and I think in media organizations.
Julia?
Right. So hi, for those that were not here yesterday, I am Cecilia Ricap, Associate Professor in Economics at University College London. So I broadly have the same question for both of you, and thanks a lot for the presentations. To some extent, and before you mentioned them, I was already thinking about the subscription type and Mediapart and so on. But Mediapart is an alternative to Le Monde. It's not an alternative to social media. And if we think of a European social media, public-led European social media, then we have a problem, which is a problem by design, which is that you need people that reads and creates content. But the way in which social media works and why it is so effective is because the algorithms by design are designed to create addiction. So how can we assure that this public social media that will be an alternative is read widely and that we have people creating content there when the incentives that make this, the private ones work, should definitely not be there. And then this leads me to how to solve the problems like the 2027 election in France, and which even if we solve this problem with the public social media, probably it will be too soon to have a public social media with the network effects and working and so on. And I wanted to ask you a bit more, well, in the case of France, about ARCEP. And if you see, ARCEP is like Ofcom from France, and on the same for Germany, if you see that there is a role that these institutions can play. Also, I do know that ARCEP was trying to do and was really understanding what was at stake also in terms of AI and the risks and so on. So yeah, I was thinking is maybe that can work in some way, or if you had other ideas on how to do this in the meantime. Thank you.
No, so you're absolutely right. That there are a number of key building blocks that you need to have, and that we don't necessarily have content production, but even if we had that, medium, this and we won't have, and the incentives we miss. So I don't have a very good solution for dealing with the social media problem, other than, and this is I think your mention of RCEP is, other than intensifying the control. Sadly, I don't think this can be done at the national level. And so I think that is really a prerogative of the EU. And I'm going back to my point about making social media companies responsible for their, which, I understand from the US perspective is fundamentally opposed to how they view here. But I think this is something that we need to enforce in Europe. Sadly, I don't see the political avenue for.
DG Connect is totally in favor of big tech in the end of the day.
And more broadly, I mean, we're already backtracking on some of the things that, some of the timid things that we had done. So I don't see the. You're right that Mediapart, as well as Le Grand Continent, by the way, these are not mass media. They are very media projects. I think Mediapart is doing a slightly better job at trying to speak to a broader audience the last few years by creating podcasts and video content, quite new, and including free video content. I think they're basically trying to bigger audience fairly successfully so. But I agree with you, that's not yet, you know.
No, and it's not only not being available, it's not only the role they play when they are on TikTok or Instagram,
Yeah.
it's the infrastructure.
Yeah.
The infrastructure would still be Instagram and TikTok. You need to play by their roots to be there as well and make the message arrive. But it's a different type of business. It's how do we create a space where people can express themselves, but where the creation of those posts or videos or whatever is not driven to generate profits of a few, is not driven to favor people's addiction and continuous scrolling there and so on.
Question, we have to design a new technical other algorithms, the algorithms who are related to these values I mentioned. So, and I think the first step, and the second step is the question of how to organize this. And I think public service media are the best way. Media and journalism, so, and one really has a solution for that. So, I think in all countries, in the local and regional newspapers, so, and with me also, and I think we have to find new ways of finance these media, and I think the best model is still by fees, and then third thing, I think we shouldn't try to copy these platforms. We don't need a second YouTube. We don't need a second TikTok. We have to find services related on the one hand to these values. On the other hand, yes, it must be attractive. And that means we should also have another habit. So much more experimental. So what we can see in Germany for this platform for young people. So it's really a success. So to find out if a community of practice with the audience, also find out this format is really interesting for them. So let them participate in discussions and so on. So that is a hard way. So these are the so small steps I mentioned in my.
Christoph, I was thinking that you gave a very complex dynamic paper in an almost policy speak, let's say as a kind of recommendations. So I wanted to see if I understand the more complex moves in it, or if I understand them correctly. It seemed to me that part of your argument was that a sort of public service media are essential to the capacity to have something like a public sphere. And that this is a sort of untraditional position insofar as the public sphere argument generally assumes the kind of communicative action scenario, which is where the dynamism is built into the situation. But if I understand correctly, your version is that the situation is deteriorating at such a rate or in such a way that you actually kind of really need somebody who's there not necessarily as a regulator, but as a sort of regulator of truth in this scenario, or at least not necessarily of truth, but of a kind of, let's say, middling or reasonable position, without which you basically end up with a sort of scenario where the AfD can basically throw around anything that it wants, and there is no plausible counterweight. I'm just using the AfD, but that would not be the only scenario. And if I understand correctly, then your suggestion was that the values that you listed are in a way points of agreement in which people can kind of, without really caring to openly agree, generally agree on these subjects as to what they would want to be able to see. So that's a really interesting, to me, that's a really interesting scenario in that there's both a sense that obviously you can't sort of over-regulate a certain world, and yet at the same time, you can't not over-regulate a certain world if you're going to have some version of a commitment to it. And I was wondering if in a way you could say a little bit more about these, let's say, tensions or dynamics, that in a way, I almost wish that, this sort of happened just kind of by accident, that we put you before Shahin. But had you given that right after Shahin, I wonder if that would have sounded like a much more tense and pressing direction insofar as the pressure that comes into this paper. I wanted to ask then, do you think that this is a situation that's capable of locking out claims that have no truth value whatsoever, but pretend to have a truth value? As we were saying with Elvira yesterday, where you suddenly have, anti-vaxxers in the US who make claims as though they're serious. But then I wonder, secondarily, what happens in the German case, let's say, how would you see this as modifying the German situation of the last 2 years on one particular subject? Really on the unspeakable in Germany of the last 2 years regarding Gaza. Is there a way in which you would see a possible scenario in which something like a German engagement with forms of suffering not really acceptable to discuss in the German public sphere at present would have been possible? Sorry, there was a lot there, but that was good.
Yes, I hope I'm able to give you. Start with the first point. Yes, I think it's regulation is not enough, so you need intermediaries, and they existed also before journalism. Starting with Georg Simmel, he developed this sociology of the third. So, and he also had one of these types of the third is the intermediary third, standing between the sources on the one hand and the audience on the other side. Let's say this metaphor of the gatekeeper, journalist as gatekeeper, is saying that they are selecting news values, and they also verify, there are also standards how to verify and so on. Had this also before, so, and they were often related, that's the idea of professional journalism related to liberal democracy. Michael Johnson described it very well for the history of journalism. And that is, let's say, also a form of regulation, but at a lower level. So these are the normative standards. There's idea that there's a consent of all people who are doing journalism, so they agree, and they also the audience agrees. So they may agree upon your expectations. So that is also a question of let's say, citizen virtues. Germany, we divide the public good and citizen virtue, Gemeinwohl and Gemeinsinn. So Gemeinsinn, the individual view on these values. So you need it. So, and the question is how does that come from? That people agree with this democratic values. That is also a point of, let's say, political education. So agree with this value. So that it's not only, or also the is dividing between the consumer value of its program and the citizen value. So divided also in their surveys. So what do you want for your own? What do you want for the society of let's say distinct groups of society? So it's also we tried also in empirical studies to divide these different views. So maybe that is part of an answer. So I don't think that the idea of a marketplace of ideas, so that it happens spontaneously. That is what we expect in social media. So there's no one who intermediates this intermediations. That is, I think, the main problem. So, and that we don't have these gatekeepers who check the quality. So, and I think it's important because we can't go back to the old times of mass media where we usually had these gatekeepers. We have now, that is a term coined by Axel Bruns, we have now gate watchers. So that means everyone can publish. So maybe we can afterwards see what was published and maybe verify, make fact checking and so on. But maybe it's too late then. So what I try to explain is that we have alternatives, better alternatives. And my hope is that public service broadcasting, not in all countries, but in several countries, can be the starting point. It means also they must be much better in this digital transformation. They have a lot of problems, so because they have all these ideas on a linear gatekeeping understanding of public sphere that must change. So because it's much more network public sphere, part of this network public sphere. So in this direction goes my argumentation. So and the second question, it's really hard for me to give you now sufficient answer because we have seen in this discussion about Gaza, like in other events before, starting with the then we had the pandemic, then we had the one in Ukraine. An immense debate about how the position of the different media are. So usually it was said, so they have only one direction. So the German Staatsräson, so all media think in this direction. So it was not a surprise for me that after all these events, when scientists had enough time to make solid content analysis, it showed them that the diversity was much bigger than expected. And as a regular reader of the Zeit, Zeitung and so on, so I wouldn't agree that all German important quality media was in line, so say what the government says. It is also, we don't have this study at the moment, so but that is what I expect of.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just wanted to react very quickly to the point about the gatekeepers. By stressing one very interesting case ongoing, to, in my view, a very surprising degree, which is basically the case made by Candace Owens, backed by some French sources, which has become like a real social media sensation, that Brigitte Macron is a man. And I think it's a very, it's both sad and funny, but it's a very interesting case because Macron is very aware and, has very acute sense of how central these issues around social media and truth are. And so I think his decision to sue Candace Owens in US courts is not only, kind of an emotional reaction to protect. Well, I think it's a very deliberate political gesture to actually test whether there can be gatekeepers. And I think the view, right or wrong, is that, if there are no gatekeepers, in government, in social media company, in broadcasting company, maybe the only gatekeepers we can find is actually the law and the judges that will eventually say what is the truth and what is not the truth. And I think it's a very important question, like, are eventually the judges the only potential gatekeepers? And I think they might be. And that leads me to your point about Germany. The worry I have, if we turn to judges for being gatekeepers, is that judges can also be subverted. And I think in the case of Germany and in the case of Gaza, they have proven to be. Actually, on several occasions, judges have approved, the cancellation of pro-Gaza demonstrations, have approved the cancellations of events that I think in normal times would have just been. And they have, precisely for the words that you've used, they have precisely because Staatsräson is basically this moment where we suspend the law. And this is why I think it's so corrosive in the German public to use and refer to Staatsräson as acceptable term to defend the Germany's position with Israel, because it actually creates the framework by which we suspend the rule of law.
We have just 5 minutes left, so it'll have to be a somewhat abbreviated question and somewhat abbreviated responses, perhaps for Andrea.
Oh, thank you. I found the panel really interesting. I've been thinking about the phenomenology of media and social media in particular for quite some time. And something that I think is also interesting to consider is that, platforms have a life cycle, right? To some extent, at least. Facebook had a life cycle. Of course, it changes into something else, right? Now we're definitely in a moment in the history of media when, short form content seems to be very much on the rise. It's ubiquitous. It's so ubiquitous that, it's called traditional media are starting to, very heavily lean into that. And I was thinking that perhaps something that may be missing from the conversation is also considering what may be coming next, right? Insofar as the battle to regulate and in some way control these instantiations of social media in everyday life, not just a rearguard battle that we're trying to deal with something that is not happening now, but it's something that is some way more positive. And I really don't have a way of kind of looking into the crystal sphere and saying what's coming next. But there is an interesting parallelism here that, again, I'm just kind of thinking with you more than, providing a hypothesis of whether it's the case of an aspect of social life that was completely taken over by a digital ecosystem, and now it's kind of dwindling, and that is dating apps. Dating apps were in many regards considered to be a kind of inevitable outcome of how interpersonal socialization from a romantic standpoint was going to take place in the 21st century. And for all sorts of reasons that are very complex, and it would be really interesting to study them, their popularity is actually fading quite substantially, right? And so my very open-ended question to the two of you is, what could it be that may provoke, a similar kind of declining life cycle of, the social medias that we're dealing with all the problems that they entail, and what may be coming next? And I realize that this is a very open question, but I think that it's important to trace some parallelisms between, systems that work in similar fashions, especially when it comes to their implementation. That's why I was talking about dating apps, given the importance of the topic.
No, it's a very good question. So maybe a quick remark on dating apps. I wonder whether, this decline, which is very intriguing indeed, this decline of the use of dating apps is not a more problematic flip coin of just, the real and documented decline of dating, period. So basically,
but there's an uptick in dating. Now, a very recent study showed that, in fact, there's an uptick now after COVID.
In dating?
Yeah, exactly. And also in sexual, intercourse. Sorry for interrupting you. It was just
okay.
Very interesting.
I was left with the idea that basically there was a profound drop in both, datings and sexual activity. And as a result, if you renounce dating and sexual activity, you should renounce dating app. And so you're saying,
I'm saying that, it was a paper came out a couple of days ago that shows that exactly the same methodology that established what you're discussing shows that indeed that there is a substantial uptick, especially in younger generations, which in some ways seems to disprove that really convincing narrative of it that I too was under the impression of that you're, not just.
I didn't know. So that was just a,
yeah.
And on, so as, outside of that, the dating parallel, yes, I mean, I don't know. Maybe we will see. My fear is that what we have seen so far is indeed like, these platforms have a life cycle, but they tend to be replaced by something else that performs kind of the same function in slightly worse ways. So I don't know if there is much hope from, Instagram will be displaced by, TikTok, and TikTok by something else, but they all kind of perform the same function. So I don't know if there's much to hope from that displacement, but this is conjecture.
Can I answer your question?
Yes.
Because it's not my turn, but it's very interesting. We're also witnessing a backlash actually on social media in general, in the new generations. It's very, very interesting. And regarding the next move, it's going to be actually worse. It's going to be the metaverse. And it's still, they are working on it. We have many doctrines now in Finland, Saudi Arabia, Zuckerberg, of course, working on it. So it's going to be just work because we're going to have this augmented reality. And social media is already the last old generation of yeah, being linked to others.
It's always hard to look in the future. I started in the midst of the 1990s to do research on the digitalization of society, and so many surprising things. Maybe I would say that these digital tools are a form of social engineering that form our social life. So maybe three visions. One could be much more individualization, isolation with AI of single person. So I have empathy with you, the bot, and so on. No one else. So if you feel great with that. The second vision could be that these tools are used for mobilization, so to define new groups and maybe also different political groups. Point five is a friend-enemy relationship, so if it's used by owners of these platforms. And the third vision I try to develop here in my presentation. So it may be a three-dimensional virtual reality, AI or conventional form. So I think it's interesting to analyze this with these different social forms.
Well, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists one more time. We'll recommence at 11:30.